Hi, this video is intended for programmers who are learning to develop Flutter apps. You've probably already built a few apps at this point, and you understand how to create a variety of different widgets, and you can make those widgets interactive. What I want to focus on specifically in this video is how you pass information or data back and forth between different widgets in an app. So this is really intended for the developer who understands how to create a widget tree, but at this point is in need of creating a second set of widgets and maybe passing the data back and forth between them. And I'm actually specifically creating this video for a class that I'm teaching at the current time. So if you're watching from that, then you understand what we're doing. For everybody else, what I've been doing is working on the first stages of an app that builds a grocery list for the user. I actually have some of the code here, and I'm actually not going to write any code in this particular video. That's going to be in the follow-up ones. The purpose of this one is just to give sort of a conceptual overview so that you have a deep understanding, or at least a conceptual understanding, of the different ways that we can go about this data passing problem. And so I'm going to show you how the app exists right now and talk about my next steps in it and why I need to do what I'm going to do. And then I'm going to run through some concepts and talk about the different ways that it can be handled. I'm going to do it just kind of by writing and drawing, and then in the follow-up video and all the follow-up videos, I'll start to kind of try the different approaches that I'm going to talk about today. So this will all become more clear when I show you what I've got. So here's what the app is. I'll show it to you. It's really very simple at this point. Basically, you have just a simple grocery list that you can add items to. All right, so I'll come down here and type in, let's say I'm going to buy some pickles, and then I can add that to my list. You can remove items from the list by swiping either left or right. If you swipe to the left, you simply remove the item. If you swipe to the right, you remove the item, but you actually add it to a cart as an item that you have already, quote unquote, put into your basket. So that differentiates the things that, you just don't want anymore from the ones that you've purchased. And I can go back and continue to add more. You can also sort these things. If you hold and click and hold for a while, you can move them around and put them in an order that's more meaningful for you as you walk around the store. So that's where we're at. So at this point, if I were actually developing this into a full-fledged app, I'd have to start thinking about a way to manage the separate grocery lists that I might make. So I'm constructing one right now, but there's going to come a time where I actually want to save this list and maybe create a new one, and then maybe come back to it at some later point in time. So obviously I need another page or another view where I can manipulate at a more global level the different lists that I'm creating. So right off the bat, that necessitates the need for another set of widgets, right? And for the time being, I'll just say another page, right? So that's one motivation for that. Another possibility where I might incur that same need is if I wanted to be able to click on one of these things and sort of drill down into it. Maybe I want to leave myself a note about the kind of oranges that I want. I want mandarin oranges this week, right? And so I'd click or double click, and then it would sort of focus on that one object, and then I would get an editable box where I could type more about that item. And so that could also be a reason that I would want to show a whole other view of widgets. Okay, so I'm going to kind of go into the different ways in general that we could accomplish this. And then, as I said, I'll actually sort of one by one look at those different methods in code and do a series of videos that follows up. But I really think it's important at first to understand just what it is that we're doing before we just go ahead and write the code to do it. Okay, so here's where we're at. We've got the I'm not going to go through what all this is, but basically I'm going to start right here with the extension to the state class. All right, so I have a stateful widget, and I extend the state here, and I simply call that class my homepage state. And inside of that class is this list, right? This string list of all the items. And this list or array, whatever you want to call it, is what's getting appended to when I add items in the UI, and they're getting then deleted from that list, obviously removed when I delete them. And also I'm maintaining the arrangement by literally just here, the arrangement of them in the list, right? When you saw me move those things around. So this obviously, this particular variable here, which is called groceries, this list is important. This is the data in my app that I need to have access to. So if I go to some other screen, which controls, say, the overall saving and reviewing of individual grocery lists, I need to have access to those lists from that other widget. Just keep that in mind, okay? The rest of it is not really crucial to understand at this point. I've got a reorderable list that's created, which is what allows me, it's a widget that you can, it's prefab. You can take it right off the shelf and use it in your Flutter apps. And I've got some dragging that's enabled on that. I'm using list elements known as dismissables, which can be dismissed with a swipe left or swipe right. None of that is really crucial for understanding this video, because again, what I want to focus on is what do we do so that we can get to a new quote-unquote page and yet still have access to this data that's right here. All right, so first I'm going to talk about the different overarching approaches to doing this. So, all right, I'm going to come over here to this whiteboard so I can make some diagrams. So what we have here currently is this first sort of page that we're looking at, right? That's this. All right, it's everything you see here. It's all the widgets that are creating this particular view that you see. So really what I'm calling a page, right? For me, this is page 1. Really, it's just a collection of widgets, right? And I think that's important to keep in mind. It's just a tree of widgets that are all maintained inside of a particular class. It just so happens that this one page is completely designed and controlled by this class that I have right here, which is called _ my homepage state. All right, that class is the overarching controller and defining agent of that particular collection of widgets. All the widgets are defined, and all their callback methods, when you click on the buttons and everything, so on and so forth, that's all inside this one class that I have here. Okay, so I'm just going to notate that by kind of putting up here to the right of page 1 in a little box, right? Class 1. Now we all know, having just seen that, that's called my homepage class, right? I'm not going to write that, but that's what it is. Okay, so this class kind of acts like the controller for that collection of UI elements. And in fact, it's called that in other mobile app development environments. If you're programming directly for iOS and you're writing in Objective-C or Swift, this would be called a view controller class. And it would control the particular view that you had on the screen. In that environment, those things are kept separate. The class that controls the view and the actual definition of the elements on the page, those are kept in different spaces. And the view controller can kind of reach down into the UI, and it can manipulate and interact with the things that are in there. In Flutter, the UIs are more declarative, and the way we have it done, the functionality of the actual UI and the declarations, definitions of the content is all kind of together in this one class that I have here, which is the my homepage state. It doesn't have to be that way. We could design this differently, but if we're following a lot of the practices that we learned from the online documentation, this is sort of the way that the Flutter team wants you to write your Flutter apps. All right, so we've got this class, and inside this particular class is where we have the definition of the groceries list, which is the item that is of utmost importance to us, because that's the data that we obviously have to get access to from everywhere in the app, right? So let me just note that. Let me just write in here, just say the groceries, this is the data Okay, that thing right there. All right, now I decide, well, it's time to make another page. So come over here, let me draw that like so. What do I do? So for starters, a couple of different, well, there are a couple ways to think about this. So this is page 2, obviously. Page 2. Now I can make a whole other class to control this if I want to. This should be class number 2. And inside this, the definition of this class, I could declare all of the widgets that I want to have. So since I said, well, what I want to do is create a page where I can actually manage lists at large, I might put some kind of scroll list in here that would contain a reference to each one of the grocery lists, these things here that I've made. But how do I do that? How do I take this data right here and have access to it from in this class? How does this class sort of reach over here and gain access to that so that it can maybe populate its UI with some of the information that's from this list? And moreover, how does it then save this information? How does it manage this? How does it control these lists at a higher level if it doesn't have access to them? So I have this problem of being able to pass the data between classes. So I have to think about that. How is it that I accomplish that? Now, this is very much synonymous with what happens when you're developing for the web and you decide to make yourself a multi-page web app. And then you're faced with the dilemma of how it is that I get data from one web page to another web page in my app. And obviously there are ways to do that, okay? And there are ways to do that in this environment too. So if that's the approach, if that's what you want to do, and there is another way that we can handle this entirely, a completely different way. But if this is how you want to have it, if you really want to think in terms of individual pages and having these pages have access to each other's data, how do we do that? Well, first off, in Flutter, pages are not called pages, okay? They're called routes. R-O-U-T-E-S. So here is an app with 2 routes. And Flutter has something known as a navigation object or navigation controller, which allows you, it's called navigator, literally, which allows you to switch from one route to another. A navigator does that for you using functions, calls such as navigator.push and navigator.pop. So if that's the approach that you're taking, then you have to look a little bit into how navigators work. And there's plenty of documentation about this on the Flutter site. When you do that, navigators actually provide you with a way of passing the data back and forth between the routes. They have sort of you can think of it almost like a pipeline or a channel that allows the data to get handed from one route to the other. And it's done by creating a JSON-like data structure with keys and values. And you're all familiar with what that means, I hope. And then the data can be both passed to a new route and manipulated in that location, passed back to the original route, and so on and so forth. Okay, so that is definitely one approach to solving this problem. And I'm just going to create a little, sticky over here. Actually, you know what? I'm going to make a text file. Okay, so we'll put this up on the screen. And let's make the font a little bit bigger so you can see. All right, so we're working under the assumption of the fact that you want to make a multi-page, multi-route app. That's the first way of solving the problem that we have, which is of getting the different functionality, the different groupings of widgets on the screen. And so the problem is, how do we pass data back and forth between distinct classes. One, let's say because each route is controlled / defined by its own class. Right? So how do we do that? And the first solution to that is that you simply use Navigator. Right? Capital N because it's the name of a class, which I said is documented nicely in the Flutter API. And Navigator allows, I'm just going to call it a pipeline because I like that terminology, for passing data back and forth between routes in key value pairs. Okay, now that being said, if you like this idea, and this is certainly promoted by the Flutter team, then we're done. You don't need to watch the rest of this video. You can just go ahead and learn about Navigator and how to pass the data back and forth, and that's it. This will work, and that is a perfectly acceptable method for handling your data. Okay, so that's certainly doable. But I think, whenever you're learning development, it really helps to have as many options as possible on the table. And the whole purpose of this particular video is really to just kind of give you the lay of the land, so to speak, and talk about the different possibilities and help you to develop larger ideas about the design of your app and the kinds of things you're going to need. So a perfectly viable option. Go read about that if you like that. I will certainly do a follow-up video that uses Navigator and demonstrates how this works, okay? Option number 2, what else could you do? Well, it's very common when you're looking at tutorials online and the people who are developing these, or the people making the videos have this or a similar problem, to do this. There's another kind of and I'm not going to call this a hackish way of solving it, but in a way it kind of is. And let me explain. So what you could do is you could save the data to something called shared preferences. And again, you can very easily look up what that is, but any app has a core storage data space it's really intended for saving user preferences about the app. Color of the interface that the user likes to select. Maybe you have different colored skins that you put on it, and I like the pink one, you like the blue one, and those preferences need to be saved along with the app so that when I open my app it looks like what I want it to. You get the concept of preferences. Okay, so there's this area called shared preferences. It's a core data storage area that goes along with any app. If you delete the app, you delete the shared preferences. Well, you can kind of hack that to store not just preferences, but anything, any as long as it's a small amount of data. So you can actually take the data that's inherent in this grocery list and you can write it to shared preferences and save it at an app level, and then you can access it again from the other UI when you need it. And then that widgets in this UI can actually rewrite and edit what's saved to the shared preferences, and you go back and forth. So kind of what you're doing in that case is instead of creating the pipeline back and forth between the two routes, which is what option number 1 is all about, right? Using Navigator with a pipeline for passing the data back and forth. Now what you're doing is you're still using different routes and you're still using Navigator, but instead of pushing the data back and forth through this little tube that I drew here, what you're doing is you're just kind of making this sort of over here, this little storage box, right? And I'm going to stress that this storage box is not really intended for what you're doing with it, but it'll work. You're just taking this data that you have up here, these groceries, and you're just kind of copying them over to here. You're saving it here, right here, and then you're grabbing it, and then you're putting it back, and then you're grabbing it when you need it. So that's completely viable. And if you want to take that approach, you can read about shared preferences. Now, that's fine, but shared preferences are not intended for saving large amounts of data, so I would not suggest doing this if your lists grow very, very long. If things get to that point, then instead of doing this kind of a thing, what you're going to want to do is literally work with a more legit data storage box that you can use inside of any app. Such a storage box usually takes the form of what's known as an SQLite database. So if you need something a little more robust, and I'll put that over here as this circle, then that's what you would do. You would create an instance of SQLite, DB for short, and you would write to it internally from your app, pulling and pushing data to that database from individual routes or pages inside your app. And then you would have access to whatever you need whenever you need it. All right. That's option number 2. Where are we? All right. Save the data to shared preferences, or even better, an SQLite database. And read and write to it internally from each route/page of your app. That will work. And if you want to go read about shared preferences and how to set up an SQLite database to do such things, by all means, go for it. What you will find is that you run into a significant degree of asynchronous code when you're doing this, because reading and writing operations are not guaranteed to happen instantly, and you have to wait for data to return before you can move on and do something with it. In the meantime, you might want to be doing other things in your app, so you want to mark functions as asynchronous while they're reading and writing to your database, and then they have to notify when they've concluded that work. Now, at some point, you need to learn to do this sort of thing anyway. Personally, I would argue this could be overkill for many apps. But it is a solution, all right? It is certainly something that's viable. Again, you're still going to have to use Navigator to get back and forth between those routes. You're still using Navigator. So you're still going to have to learn about that. Okay, option number 3. What else could you do? Well, you could create the original data in some type of global storage, or I'm not going to say global, sorry, global scope in your app's code. In other words, instead of defining the grocery list here inside my homepage state right here, instead of doing this, I very well could have made this outside the scope of this class and kind of like put it up here in global scope. And for many of you in my classes, coming from the programming background that you have, where you've been writing and developing Java, using Java in a processing-like environment, you are very, very familiar with this concept of just sort of declaring global variables at the top of your program before you start getting into your individual classes. Could you do that? Yeah, sure, you could do that. Should you do that? No, you shouldn't. Avoid global variables in that sense whenever possible. And we could talk about that at some other time, why you want to do that, but I think a lot of you already know why that's a bad idea. So it'll work. Is it a great idea? No, it's not a great idea, but it leads to a couple of great ideas. So create the original data in some type of global scope in your app's code and just access it from within, or just access the variables. Let's put that, the global variables, from within whatever class you want. All right, and I'm just going to say, nah, don't do this. There are far better approaches. There's a couple of more advanced options. You can read about something called scoped access if you want to, using what are known as inherited widgets. This is a relatively advanced topic, and to be honest, it's fallen out of popularity, I would say, in the last 9 months or so. And there are better options that are out there, but it is certainly a viable thing that you can do. And what it is basically is it's more formally creating a global space that widgets can access the data from, but not in this manner. All right, so it's a more involved idea. I'm not writing any code tonight, so I can come back to it at a later date. Probably the other more celebrated method of doing this is to use something known as providers and streams to get the job done, to share data across different classes / models. And again, that's documented. Providers, what are they? What do they do? And setting up a stream so that any widget can subscribe to that stream so that it can get data when it needs it. It can read and write in that manner. So that's another approach to getting it done. And again, I'm going to tackle that in a later video. I think I'll probably look at this and this first, and then maybe this third. And those are probably the best. 1, 2, and 5 are probably the 3 most popular ways and the best ways of getting this done. So that's one way of solving the problem. Now, that's great, but there's a whole other approach to this. So this is all working under the assumption that what we really want to do is make an app with multiple pages or routes to handle the different functionality and the different features. But we don't have to do that. Okay, so instead what we could do, I'm just going to erase all this now. What we could do is literally just make a single page app, an app with one page and only one page. And if you think that sounds a little simplistic, keep in mind that as time has gone on over the course of the last 6 to 7 years, more and more web pages that are apps have gone to a single page design. Single page web apps are becoming increasingly popular. And there's good reason for it. Users like the experience. When you keep somebody on a single page, it can be sometimes more comforting than swapping out the entire page and going to some other location. And there are some design aspects that we have to keep in mind when we do that. I don't want to talk about what those are, but it does remove the need for sharing data between classes, because now technically you really only need this one class right here. And what you're going to do is, instead of using a whole other class to define a whole other page or route, you're literally just going to take and swap out all the widgets that used to exist inside this page with some other ones. And I think almost everyone watching this video has done some degree of web programming, and so you're very familiar with this idea of using JavaScript on a web page to just get rid of what you saw and replace it with a whole lot of new stuff without actually changing to a new page. Right? We had libraries for a long time that we relied on to do that. jQuery was born out of, well, that's one of the reasons that jQuery was so popular in the beginning. There are other ones such as cross-browser compatibility of code and so on and so forth. But there evolved a whole ecosystem of web JavaScript technologies to be able to stay on a web page and just change what was being presented on that page. And so we can take that same idea and we can extend it here and just go with a single page app or a single route app. In that case, you don't need to talk about navigation, navigator, or any of these other things that I've mentioned. But you do need to look at how it is you're going to swap the widgets and show new ones when the time comes. So let's talk just a little bit about that. All right, so going back over to this document that I have here. All right, so now I'm going to say, all right, what if you're building a single page / route app? What do you do? All right, well, first off, the easiest thing that you can do, the easiest way to make a bunch of widgets disappear and make a whole new set of widgets up here is just to create some Boolean switches. Right? I'm just going to say raw Boolean switches. And here's what I mean by that. What you could do is you could have some Boolean, such as bool view 1. Right, and you initialize this to true, right? Or for that matter, you could have it be an integer. Right? You could say num view, and you could default this to 1 because it's your first view. And so I say Boolean, but whatever you want it to be. And then you could make your UI conditional on the value of this variable. In other words, what gets drawn depends upon what this variable is. So you press a button somewhere in your first view, and that changes this to a 2. And because of that, a whole different set of child widgets get drawn. So back here in the code, see, at any point in time where I'm creating, let's look down to where I'm creating some child widgets. Let's see. Let's go down. Child, right? I'm choosing to show this as the child widget. All right, let's see, do I have a column widget in here? I don't know that I do. Let's see, column. Yeah, okay, so in my body, so I have my scaffold, and then here in the body I have a column, and then I have children, and I choose to have my children be all of this stuff. That's right here. Right. So I have something called an expanded, and then a text field, a raise button, and so on and so forth. But you know what? I can make this all conditional. This can all be based on an if, else kind of structure, so that I could say, you know, show these things if some particular variable is equal to 1. But you know what? If it's equal to 2, show a whole bunch of different things. And that way, when you press some button, you'll actually change all of the widgets that are in front of you. All right, so I'm just going to write, let's see, press a button in the UI, flip the value of a variable, and you know, you call set state, of course, right? Set state at that point, and make the child widgets or even the whole scaffold if you want to. You could show a whole different scaffold conditional based on this Boolean value. That'll work. And then in fact, you're still working in the same class, so you have access to the data that you so badly need access to, which is this grocery list, wherever it is. Where the heck did I put that thing? It's right up top here, right? So this thing, you still have access to it because you're still inside the _myHomepage class, right? That's cool. So that's one option. There are some problems with it. One of them is it's mostly a user frustration. If you do that, then widgets are going to change abruptly and all of a sudden, right? They're just going to flash to something different. And that doesn't make for a great app experience. So that is a serious limitation, the UI limitation. Now what you could do is, you could do the exact same thing, but you could add transitions. And these can be things like fades and all sorts of different animated transitions. So there are widgets to do that. There's something called an animated transition, where you give it the 2 widgets that you want it to transition between, and that's precisely what it does, and you can set some characteristics of that animation. And there's something called a fade transition widget as well. All right, there's a whole host of different tricks that you can do to make the replacement of one widget with another one smoother and nicer for the person using the app, right? But you still have to have some logic for when to perform that switch. There still has to be a button that gets pressed or something that happens that then transitions from one to the other. So that's a way of improving it, and we will look at those things, all right, for single page apps. And then the last thing that you can do is you can use something known as a page view widget, which, to be honest, is probably the simplest way of doing it. And what a page view widget basically does is sort of just mimics a multi-page app. And what it does is it does it by swiping, by allowing the user to swipe around and sort of dismiss a whole group of widgets and just pull in a whole new group. So you can almost think of it like a list, the way you scroll up and down a list, but in this case you're just scrolling through pages of widgets. But the entire scaffold structure, everything is still controlled, is still written inside one class. It's therefore pertaining to one route. And so you don't have this problem of access to the data because it's right here. And you can create multiple different collections of widgets and make them seem like they're on completely different pages. And then the user just literally throws their fingers up. You can go vertical or horizontal. And when you do that, you just get a whole new view with a whole new collection of widgets, which can manipulate different things in different ways, because the widgets will do whatever you tell them to do, depending on how you write their, the callbacks for the taps and the presses for the buttons and everything. All right, so that is yet another option. And to be honest, that's a really cool option and one that we definitely have to look into. So I'm going to do all of these things in follow-up videos. I think what I'll do is maybe sort of make one video about each one of these. So I'll do a video for this, a video for this, video for page view, and then I'll do a video for the navigator and shared preferences, and then providers. So maybe 5 or 6 different videos as we go through the course of the next few weeks to look at those different approaches to solving this problem. All right? But the overarching decision that you have to make first is really, do I want multiple pages in my app, or do I want a single page app? And once you make that decision, then what you actually end up doing is informed by it. So I think, I wanted to take the time to make this because while there's a lot of examples online of these different things being done, I haven't really found anything yet that lays out the landscape overall and really says, hey, you know what? Should you do it this way as a multi-page, or should you do it as a single page app? And if you do, then what are your options? And so I wanted to take the time to at least put these ideas out there before we start going into them one by one. All right, so hopefully this was helpful. Shoot me a comment or an email and let me know. And like I said, soon to follow some specific videos with code explaining these different approaches. All right, and we'll use the grocery app to do it. Thanks for watching.